Hello and welcome to this video on the Chinese solution to Pakistan's locust problem. Ducks, and lots of them.
You will watch this. Let no joyful voice be heard. Let no man look up at the sky with hope. And let this day be cursed by we who ready to wait. The quacken! Free the rudder! Hard to port and hard to starboard! Free the rudder! Hard to port!
While rather glib and a terrible pun, it is not wrong. In fact, the sheer number of ducks involved will create a quacket. While incredibly noisy, it will be effective, and it's one of China's ancient tactics to regain territory that China has held since ancient times. No wait. So while you might think, why locusts, why ducks, and isn't this a terrible idea, it's actually a surprisingly good idea, but one that fundamentally won't work in the end. First we have the locusts. Locusts are fundamentally just giant crickets. Unlike crickets, which can cause some harm to crops, these will eat a lot more. In fact, it is why they are described as a plague in biblical terms. Basically, where COVID would be a plague in the Bible, locusts are the same thing but harming food, well, at least food production. Food being rather important, not just for life, but also the economy. If you're not producing your own food, you need to import it. And as such, you begin to spend most of your GDP buying basic needs, and not on more useful things like healthcare, education, and so on. We saw this exact thing with Sri Lanka, where they went all organic and absolutely decimated their agricultural sector. But now we need to look at why there are locusts in Pakistan, and why they are suddenly a problem. In this case, we're talking about the desert locust. It's a specific subspecies of the overarching locust species. They are a reasonably solitary creature, normally. Kinda like online trolls or fairies. The key here is that after a period of drought, followed by high rainfall, the population of locusts will balloon. After this, the population is like a fat man at a buffet when the food has run out. They start looking for more, whether it's their own food, someone else's plate, or whatever the kitchen's cooking. In this case, locusts travelled first around the Arabian Peninsula after having pissed off parts of Africa. The Arabian Peninsula being Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and so on. After this, the locusts travelled further east, with the next stops being India and Pakistan. Thankfully, to some extent, India was not hit as hard, but they're still somewhat concerned. But this brought a rather terrifying locust to Pakistan particularly, and they had to deal with this from 2019 onwards. It was, and arguably will continue to be, the worst plague in about 3 decades. Admittedly, not the worst plague that's occurred in, let's say 4,000 years, if we assume the Bible's vaguely accurate, or if you want to look at other issues recently, well, let's say 2 years. As you can imagine, suddenly having millions and millions of locusts show up and start eating your food, it's going to be a problem. If it was just your own meal, you'd probably be annoyed. If it's the food for thousands, and you're Pakistan's government, you are not just annoyed, but rather terrified. A hungry populace is a volatile populace. Just ask any of the last 7 French republics, before they raised the national French flag. The problem for Pakistan is that while affecting food crops, this locust plague also affected cash crops like cotton. That means even if they wanted to let it slide for now, they wouldn't be able to pay for imported food, so it has to be dealt with. This is where the Sindh Chamber of Agriculture says that they have to act very quickly, as at least half of the crops that are near the port city of Karachi have been destroyed by locusts. That's half of what could have been sold or eaten. The government of Pakistan preliminarily estimated it there would be a loss of somewhere between $3.4 and $10.21 billion. That's billion with a B. And there would be 3 million people, or possibly more than that, facing severe and very sudden food insecurity. 3 million people who are hungry, angry, and looking for a solution, which may or may not involve finding a local politician and reenacting the Vlad the Impaler scene. Pakistan also has other issues. There are 220 million people there, so even if just 3 million are facing issues with food, there are 217 other million people who are likely to be angry for other reasons. This will include the fact that they're going to miss their wheat production targets by about 2 million tons, they're going to have to import grain, and they're going to have to pay for that. And obviously, given how much they're going to miss it by, import a fair amount. That means your basic things like wheat, and particularly flour from wheat, are going to get more and more expensive. If you think inflation has hit food hard, imagine if you instead had to, rather than shop at wherever it is you shop regularly, go to something like Whole Foods, where buying something very basic like a loaf of bread involves trading it for a kidney. In Pakistan, it's not quite at that level, thankfully. It is, however, bad. Inflation has risen by about 10% in just September alone. So, yeah, things are not looking good. The first solutions that were considered, and mostly used, were chemical, physical, and similar means. Essentially, they would go into a field, and if all else wasn't going to work, they'd basically set off the equivalent of a giant bug bomb. Now, they do this every morning. That means every morning, the fields would be covered in this rather nasty gas that would kill off all of the locusts. And that does mean they're gone, but it does also raise issues, particularly around the cost of the insecticide to start with, but also importantly, how safe is the food to eat as a result? On top of this, the government was also paying a bounty for every locust. Admittedly, it's a fairly good bounty at that, where the husk, the dead locust insect, was worth about 20 rupees, or roughly 13 American cents. Per kilogram, mind you, so you'd need a fair number of them, but when you consider that it's a lot easier at the moment to harvest locusts than it is to actually harvest food, that's a reasonable yield, or at least return on your investment. Your next option is more typical, let's say, and that is quite literally getting your tractor with your sprayer attached to it and go out there and spray your crops with various insecticides and pesticides, killing them off that way. Now, this is somewhat successful, although arguably not as successful, as that approach requires applying the insecticide twice a day. Unlike the giant bug bomb, so to say, it's a very labor-intensive, very expensive process, and unfortunately it also means the crops are completely useless and need to be destroyed. Yeah, you've basically lost all round, with the sole exception that you've somehow managed to dispose of the locusts, at least for now. And there are those who have, quite literally had to go to the most desperate of measures after they realised we can't afford to do this, both from a buying insecticide point of view and from the loss of crop point of view. They've basically gone out in the fields themselves trying to catch the locusts and banging on pots to try and scare them away, or similar. And now for the quackening, which sadly never happened. Although this isn't a terrible idea, in fact it is a much better example of previous attempts to do something similar. To use a historical comparison that's reasonably understandable, Australia had a cash crop in the form of sugar. This is made by growing sugar cane. The sugar cane had a problem. A native beetle had a very strong preference for this sweet plant, and this negatively affected production. Given farmers were rather annoyed by this, they decided to solve the problem, and they solved it by one simple animal: cane toads. Australia made the decision to import cane toads. As anyone who's a fan of history, or Australian bogans will know, this came with a certain problem. The cane toads are not a good solution. They bred out of control, and didn't really fix the problem in the form of the cane beetle, and in the long terms led to other extensive environmental, economic, and practical problems. This brings us to why ducks are not just a better idea, but arguably a good idea. The cane toads were a bad idea, as they are somewhat poisonous and there was no natural predator for them in Australia. That meant they could, and did, breed out of control, and they have since the time of introduction slowly spread further and further south. And ducks, not so much, and we're talking about Pakistani ducks now, not Australian ducks. The ducks aren't poisonous at all, but they do have natural predators and a limited ability to breed. The best point is that the duck is a moving protein bank that will eat the locusts. And that means the duck can be used to remove the locust plague, or at least significantly reduce the impact of the locusts on both food and cash crop production until a more substantial and permanent solution can be implemented. Once this is done, the ducks go from being pest control to being food, let's say. Even if not eaten, they're not going to create a cascading problem of other complications with a limited population, slow generation time, and a much more limited generational population increases. Basically, once the ducks start breeding out of control, you have so many ducks that they basically can't feed themselves anyway, so it's a self-limiting population, unlike the cane toad, which basically managed to find a way to cope in Australia, which says a lot about the cane toad than it does about the Australian government at the time. The problem with all of this, and we want to reiterate how important it is, not just from a food security point of view, but from a purely economic point of view. Agriculture, that is your cash crops and your food production, accounts for about 20% of Pakistan's gross domestic production, and unfortunately, the desert locust-induced damage is going to drop production in the agricultural sector in its entirety by about 2% in just 2020. Understand, this has been going since 2019, so the government is continuing to try and knock it down, with effectively little success, although it is getting there gradually. When you combine this with other issues, such as several years of drought, longer-term issues around water availability that's not from the sky, and you have issues to do with inflation, particularly long-term historic inflation, something most people will be feeling the pain of now, you can see how this is a problem. It's essentially increased the price of things like flour and sugar by about 20% since 2020 alone. When you look at this by a more district-by-district basis, you have nearly a quarter of Punjab's district invaded by the swarm, you have about 16% of the Bawanagar district, a little over 10% of the Lodran district, you have the Kachchi and Karan districts, around 7.5% to 7% respectively, and you have the Laki Mawat and Tank districts, around 4 and 3% respectively. That's pretty damn bad. Anytime you have a drop that much, you're going to see significant impact locally, let alone at a national level. The less significantly affected regions brings us back to something like Sindh, where that port of Karachi is located, where it's only 1% of the total area that's been affected, but that's still pretty significant. And the species that are most damaged are going to be things like your mangoes, cotton, potatoes, cumin, and fodder grasses. Of these, mangoes are a staple food to an extent, cotton is particularly important cash crop, potatoes are a cash crop and a staple food, cumin is a fairly common spice, and fodder grasses are kind of important when we talk about livestock. As you can see, Pakistan was invaded by a locust plague. And to be honest, we had China on our bingo card, not locusts, but, well, it is what it is. The locust ate up all of the Pakistani food, or at best a very large part of it. They ate or destroyed a lot of the cash crop in many regions. They exacerbated existing economic, financial, agricultural, and political issues. They carry on affecting Pakistan, and that effect, let's say, is not to be underestimated, as we will likely see these not just continue for several more years, but that the situation may get worse. Understand, at the present, they seem to have been able to reach a sort of status quo with the locusts, where it's not getting worse, but they aren't managing to get it better just yet, and there are some fairly significant concerns that there may well be another instance of outbreak by locusts, in which case you may want to start finding an ancient deity to pray to and hope that they don't send them after you, or alternatively, consider the quackening. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.